this idea up to me. I think we're going to learn a lot today about the perils of the social media sites and the internet in general for minor children, and what can we do to help and better inform parents. So well, he's on his way, and I'll give an opening statement. He'll be here in a second, I hope. We're going to the border Friday. Everybody is welcome. We're going to meet the Vice President. There's no intrigue about what we're trying to do. I haven't been in a while, and I'd like to go listen and learn. And hopefully, after our visit to the border, it will give us a better idea of what we can do legislatively to provide relief to those on the front lines of this chaotic situation at our southern border. And I'm hoping that we have a bipartisan group, and we're not going there to blame anybody. At least I'm not. I'm trying to find a solution, and I look forward to the trip. And Senator Cornyn and I know the folks in Texas are struggling mightily with this problem, and look forward to learning from our friends in Texas about what we can do. Thank you very much. I'll tell you what, we'll just go ahead and get started. Could you please raise your right hand? Rise, please. Raise your right hand. You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give this committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Okay, welcome, Mr. Stone. He's from Bluffton area, 14th Judicial Circuit Solicitor in South Carolina. Proud of your work, and welcome to Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I understand that Ranking Member Feinstein will not be able to be here, but I want to thank her as well, and thank the members of this committee for the invitation to speak to you today. I am the solicitor for the 14th Circuit. That is a circuit made up of 5 counties in the low country of South Carolina, as Senator Graham knows. I am also the incoming president of the National District Attorneys Association. For the purpose of this hearing, though, I also carry the title of parent. And I think that's particularly relevant because I think in this particular issue and this particular concept, I think we need to understand the world now that we are living in, which is substantially different than it used to be. If you think about it, parents teach their children every day to not talk to strangers, to not open the locked doors for people they don't know, certainly not to get into a car or a van with somebody they don't know. And yet, every day, and we take precautions about this. We put up locked doors, and we have our doors locked, our windows locked. We have security systems. Despite all of that, strangers are talking to our children every day. And they're doing it through the internet. They're doing it by use of the children's cell phones, often unknowingly, but by invitation from our own children. The Pew Foundation did a study recently, and I think this was a 2018 study that stated that 95% of the teens today have access to the internet through their cell phones, 45% of which are doing it almost constantly. And I don't think any of us that either have teenagers or no teenagers would doubt those statistics. If you look at it from that perspective, the question then is, what is the risk? What is the risk of these children having this type of access and people having access to our children behind locked doors? And I think our friends from the Center of Missing and Exploited Children would tell you that 18.4 million cyber tips that they received in 2018 indicate the risk to our children. And of those 18.4, after the studies were conducted, the offenders themselves, 98% of those were strangers. So strangers are talking to our children. If you look at State Department statistics, those State Department statistics will also tell you that tens of thousands of children are being exploited online. If you look at further State Department statistics concerning the role of human trafficking, you will learn that half of those are children. And what these human traffickers are doing when it comes to either labor or sex trafficking, they are using the internet to entice, coerce, and in many ways even arrange the buying and selling of our children. The internet and this cyber world that we live in, it is no longer a bricks and mortar world. It's a situation that we have to take into consideration. I am the solicitor for a 5-county circuit in South Carolina. I have, of those 5 counties, one of my counties is Beaufort County, which is the home of Hilton Head, the Heritage Golf Tournament, and what it seems like, at least this time of the year, endless tourism. It is a wealthy county, probably the second wealthiest county in the state of South Carolina. But I have, the average poverty in South Carolina is 16.6%. I have 3 counties that are below that percentage. In fact, one of my counties is Allendale County. And unless you're Senator Graham, you may never have heard of Allendale County. But Allendale County suffers at over 30% poverty. The demographics of my circuit, basically over a 3,700 square mile period, is a microcosm of South Carolina in many ways of this country. What I see in the poor as well as the wealthy areas in my circuit are the same issues when it comes to cybercrime. And briefly, I'd like to tell you what I see. I spend about 14%. My office is probably a medium-sized prosecution office when it comes to national standards. I spend about 14% of my overall personnel budget on intelligence. And part of that intelligence are computer and cell phone experts who not only download from these computers and cell phones, but also study and try to help us uncover these crimes and help law enforcement throughout our circuit make these type of cases. What I have seen professionally made music videos that are being produced by and for gang members to basically recruit our children. I have seen prisoners who operate prostitution rings outside of the prison, having already been convicted. I see not only drug dealers, gang members, but other criminals with all of the information that they have inside their cell phones, which is, in the past, it would be a notebook. Today, it's their cell phone. These events that we see, we need your help in many ways, because law enforcement and the solicitors and the district attorneys around this country, they face a little bit of a challenge. When it comes to these notebooks, the cell phones, the information that we have in there, we need help with the encryption issue. When it comes to prisons in particular, I'd like to thank Mr. Chairman Graham as well as Senator Kennedy, who's also on this committee, for sponsoring a bill that would allow our prisons to block that cell service. We think of a purpose behind a prison in isolating those people inside of it. If they have access to a cell tower and a cell phone inside their prison, we are not keeping our citizens, our community, or our children safe from them. Let me also say, and I think we have to look at it from the perspective of what type of world we're dealing with today, as opposed to what we did when I first became a prosecutor in 1989. I think the biggest change that we have seen over the past 10 years is the use of technology by criminals. We see that in every aspect of every case that we have. We have, if we go back and we talk first about the encryption issue, which I think is particularly relevant. I started my career as a narcotics prosecutor. If a police officer executing a lawful search warrant went into someone's house and found drugs, that would help them with that case. If they found guns to protect their product, that would also help. Scales, that type of thing. But in order to destroy the enterprise, if they could find the notebook, that piece of those collections of documents that told them who the major buyers were, who the sellers were, that type of thing, that's how you could actually destroy that network. Today, that's not on a notebook or a notepad like this. It's on their cell phone. We have experts that download those cell phones for law enforcement, and they do it with a court order based on probable cause. And yet, there are some cell companies that refuse to assist law enforcement in enforcing those court orders. If we are going to do those investigations, and if we are going to destroy these human trafficking enterprises, the gangs, we're going to need help with that particular aspect of it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Campbell.
Thank you.
Ms. Campbell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for inviting me. For over 30 years, I've been a professor at Georgetown Law, where as a director of a clinic, I have represented nonprofit organizations such as the Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood and Center for Digital Democracy in efforts to try to improve the media environment for our children. And I have also written a number of law review articles about that subject. So many of the problems that families are struggling with today, such as how to protect their children's privacy, how to prevent exposure to inappropriate content, and to limit the amount of time that children are spending online on digital devices, are the direct result of two things. First, it's the business models of the dominant tech companies. They've designed their systems not to protect children or nurture children, but to attract a large number of users, including children, and to keep them online as long as possible, so they can maximize revenue by collecting valuable data about those users and delivering targeted marketing to them. Second, as I explained in my written testimony, the government has failed to adopt sufficient safeguards for children and has not effectively enforced the safeguards that do exist. In particular, the Federal Trade Commission has failed to vigorously enforce the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, and as a result, the big tech companies, including Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Amazon, have felt empowered to ignore the existing safeguards. When COPPA was adopted in 1998, there was no YouTube, no social media, no smartphones, no smart speakers in children's bedrooms, and no toys connected to the internet. COPPA has not kept up with these new developments. The underlying premise of the law is that parents can protect their children if they're given adequate notice and if they have to give verifiable consent before data can be collected from their children. But practice has proven that this is no longer tenable. Another problem with COPPA is that the safeguards only come into play in certain situations, either where a website or online service is directed at children or where the operator has actual knowledge of children using a specific service. Just as a result, many times when children are online, they're not getting any of the COPPA protections. Another limitation with COPPA is that it doesn't provide safeguards once a child turns 13, and teens, because of their stage of development, are less able to evaluate risk and are very susceptible to peer pressure, so they take a lot of risks. Passing the Do Not Track Kids Act of 2019, which was introduced by Senators Markey and Hawley, would be a good first step to update COPPA. But even in the absence of new legislation, the FTC can and should act to better protect children's privacy. Since 2000, when the law took effect, the FTC has only brought 29 actions to enforce COPPA. And since 2012, I personally have been involved in filing 14 requests asking the FTC to investigate COPPA violations. Yet the FTC has not acted, at least publicly, in response to any of them. In addition to bringing more enforcement actions, the FTC should ensure that the self-regulatory COPPA safe harbor programs that Congress intended to help augment FTC enforcement are actually doing their job. And given the large number of websites and online services used by children, of course, it's not easy for the FTC to pursue all violations. For this reason, I urge that the FTC should use its authority under Section 5 to hold platforms responsible when they characterize apps or other content as appropriate for children when they are not, and conversely, when they say their services are not appropriate for children, and yet they know there are a lot of children using them anyhow. So, for example, just give you one example of a recent complaint we filed in December 2018 on behalf of those organizations I mentioned. We asked the FTC to investigate whether the Google Play Store was engaging in unfair and deceptive practices and labeling apps in the family section of the Play Store as family-friendly, when in fact the apps did not meet Google's own criteria. Google's criteria was good. It included complying with the privacy laws, prohibited deceptive or unfair ad practices, prohibited inappropriate content. But what we found through our investigation was that Google was not enforcing them. Another complaint that I'll briefly mention involves YouTube and the fact that YouTube clearly knows that there are lots of children. It's the most popular destination for children online, and yet they pretend there are no children, and so they don't apply, they don't give notice to parents, they don't comply with any of the COPPA requirements. I urge the members to put pressure on the Federal Trade Commission to enforce the laws that are on the books, and also on the companies to act more responsibly. I know a number of members have actually written letters to both the FTC and the companies. And I also urge Congress to look at what kind of new legislation might be helpful in addressing some of these, not only shortfalls, but some of the new issues that are coming up that are with facial recognition, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and other new technologies. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Good morning, Chairman Graham, Senator Blumenthal, members of the committee. Thank you so much for allowing all of us this opportunity to speak today. I cannot think of a more noble cause for all of us to be spending our time on than the safety and protection of our children. I began Protect Young Eyes 5 years ago because the internet is complex, and even diligent parents are overwhelmed by the digital choices their children are facing. Through thousands of hours of research, hundreds of presentations at schools around the country, and dozens of articles examining digital trends, we have witnessed both the wonderful potential and the troubling and pervasive darkness that exists in the pockets of millions of young people today. I'm certain that in the course of today's discussion, we will hear difficult stories. I wish they were uncommon. In March 2019, CNN reported that Instagram was the leading social media platform for child grooming by sexual predators. Our own test accounts quickly discovered that young people, particularly young girls, can be hunted like prey. We started an Instagram account with 2 photos and tried to mimic the behavior of an average teen girl. We posted 2 selfies with 3 hashtags each, searched a few hashtags, and liked a few photos. Within a week, we had dozens of men sending us images of their genitals, telling us they were horny, and sending us hardcore pornography through direct messages. Even after we told all of them that we were only 12, they were relentless. A recent poll of 2,000 teens found that nearly 75% of them had received pornographic direct messages from strangers on Instagram, even if they had a private account. But you won't find any warnings in the App Store descriptions for Instagram that mention anything about sexual predators, direct message risks, sex trafficking, or hardcore pornography. Instagram's defaults are not set for child safety or data privacy, even though Instagram is rated 12+ by Apple and 13+ by Google. At Protect Young Eyes, we've also seen firsthand the predatory symbiotic relationship that exists between Instagram and Snapchat, both used by 75% of teens today. Many Instagram predators quickly shuttle kids over to Snapchat, where evidence disappears. For example, one relentless pedophile on Instagram who calls himself Daddy invites young girls to join him in Snapchat with Instagram posts like 12+-year-old slave girls, obedient whores only, or hit me up on Snap to be Daddy's naughty girl. Snapchat is where explicit content on Pornhub lives just seconds away from every user through backdoors within the app. The app knowingly allows a well-documented list of porn performers to make thousands of dollars daily through their premium Snap accounts. Snapchat is where harmless-looking face filters can encourage kids to share their location on Snap Map. It's the app that gave a Coors beer ad to 13-year-olds, even though they tout age gating. It's the app where every kid, regardless of age, has access to the Discover News section, where they are taught how to engage in risky sexual behaviors such as hookup, group, anal, or torture sex, how to sell drugs, and how to hide internet activity from parents using incognito mode. But again, you won't find anything in Snapchat's App Store descriptions that warn parents about premium Snapchat accounts, predator risks of using Snap Maps, or the hyper-sexualized content in Discover News. Snapchat is rated 12+ by Apple and 13+ by Google. Tech companies will tell us that ratings are already in place. However, ratings are not uniform, lack transparency, and there's little accountability for inaccurate ratings. For example, Twitter was rated 4+ for a decade, even though hardcore porn and prostitution was everywhere. It is still breaking Apple and Google's no porn policy, but only claims infrequent or mild sexual content in the app description. Netflix is rated 4+ in Apple's App Store, but teen in Google Play. VPNs, which allow teens to circumvent parental controls, are rated 4+. Most social media platforms are rated 12+ by Apple, even though COPPA restricts use by children until age 13. Obviously, the current app ratings process is broken. Tech companies will tell us that protecting kids is a parent's responsibility. However, this position ignores the ubiquitous nature of the internet. Even if I do everything right to protect my own 14-year-old daughter, with almost 90% of teens owning a smart device, a simple ride on the bus or a visit to a friend's house can expose her to life-altering content. Never before in human history have young people had the ability to so radically change the trajectory of each other's lives. Already in place. It takes over 30 steps to properly set up parental controls on an iPhone. We need to simplify this process to help more parents protect their children. For example, better age-based defaults would instantly and easily protect millions of kids. The addition of easy controls over school and bedtime could shut off distracting apps during these very critical times. Tech companies will tell us that regulating apps is too big of a job. It can't be done. However, video games are already successfully doing it, and the ESRB shows us a path that could be applied by reasonable individuals to apps. In fact, it was Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook who recently said, "I believe we need more effective role for governments and regulators." And we agree. Our hope is to create safer digital places for young people. 2 simple solutions could change everything. First, create a uniform, independent, and accountable rating system for apps. And second, enact better defaults based on the age provided during device and app setup. Let's fix this for the kids. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Yeah, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and members of the committee. It's an honor and privilege to be here. I also have the honor and privilege of serving as the president and CEO of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC as we refer to it often. I'm pleased to be here today to provide NCMEC's perspective on the growing problem of child sexual exploitation online and our role in combating the dangers children are facing on the internet. NCMEC was created in 1984 by child advocates as a private nonprofit organization to help find missing children, reduce child sexual exploitation, and prevent child victimization. NCMEC's core program to combat online child sexual exploitation is the Cyber Tip Line, a tool for the public and electronic service providers to report abusive images to NCMEC. Technically, this content is legally defined as child pornography, but NCMEC chooses to use the term child sexual abuse imagery to make clear what this content truly is. Not pornography, but the rape and sexual assault of children captured on images and in video. Since we began the Cyber Tip Line over 21 years ago, report numbers have exploded. Last year alone, we received over 18 million reports of international and domestic online child sexual abuse. The number of reports is daunting, and so are many new trends, including the following. Between 2017 and 2018, video files reported to NCMEC increased 541%. A broader range of online platforms is being used to store and trade child sexual abuse images, including chat, video, and messaging apps, photo sharing platforms, social media and dating sites, gaming platforms, and email systems. If someone can share content online, NCMEC knows that platform can be used to sexually exploit a child. Reports relating to enticement and sextortion are increasing. This devastating abuse uses non-physical coercion to manipulate a child into sexual activity. We're seeing reports with graphic and violent sexual images of young children, including infants. and reports of on-demand sexual abuse known as live streaming. Virtually all reports to NCMEC come from the open web, not the dark web. But NCMEC knows that the dark web, such as Tor, are havens for new and increasingly explicit child sexual abuse imagery. In light of these troubling trends, unique initiatives are needed. Law enforcement can't arrest their way out of this. There must always be ways to rapidly detect, report, and remove such images. And this can't be done in a vacuum. Multiple layered partnerships are essential to protect children online. NCMEC has built strong voluntary partnerships with technology companies in support of our mission. These initiatives are crucial because while there is no legal requirement for technology companies to proactively screen for child sexual abuse, many companies have business reasons to do so. In support of this, NCMEC offers voluntary initiatives to proactively use hashing, including photo DNA. A hash is a digital fingerprint of an image that can scan for identical or similar images. Many online companies use hashes of known sexual abuse images to screen and remove these images from their services. NCMEC facilitates voluntary hash sharing by hosting platforms for technology companies to share over 1.2 million hashes of abusive images among themselves and hosting a second platform for nonprofits, including NCMEC, to share over 1.7 million hashes with those companies. NCMEC also is devoted to critical resources to modernizing the cyber tip line. We need to ensure that as a more complex technology is used to exploit children, we are using the most advanced technology, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, to protect children from abuse online. As detailed in my written testimony, NCMEC also provides a broad range of additional programs to support children who have been victims of online sexual abuse and to provide data-driven prevention and education programs relating to such abuse. So to conclude, the problems of child sexual exploitation are becoming more complex, more challenging. And we are fortunate to be joined in our mission by this committee, our nonprofit partners, and the U.S. technology companies. It's essential for us to continue to form broader partnerships to support our work. Also, as a society reflects on the continuing role of the internet in our daily lives, we must make sure that technology tools, such as hashing, remain viable and effective to combat the spread of online child sexual exploitation. So thank you again for this opportunity to appear before you, and I look forward to the continuing work with this committee and to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Balkam.
Good morning, Chairman Graham, Senator Blumenthal, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Stephen Balkam, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Family Online Safety Institute, or FOSI, as we call it. My message for the committee is that we, one, need to create a culture of responsibility online. Two, we need to develop resiliency in our children. And three, we must move from protection to empowerment, from blocking to monitoring, and from restrictions to responsibility. FOSI is an international nonprofit organization working to make the online world safer for kids and their families. We achieve this by identifying and promoting the best practices, tools, and methods in the field of online safety that also respect free speech. I first testified before this committee 24 years ago as part of a hearing on cyber porn and children. The technology has changed immensely over the past 2 decades, but the challenges remain. We must keep children safe on the internet while ensuring that they are able to access the amazing opportunities for learning, creativity, and fun that are available to them. Our experience has shown that by engaging all parts of the technology ecosystem, including government, industry, law enforcement, parents, and teachers, we are able to empower and instill a sense of resilience in our children, and in this way ensure their online experiences remain safe and productive. The internet enhances the educational and social lives of children. Their use of this media allows them to gain knowledge in a variety of new ways. Children are able to create and share their own content and express their ideas and experiences on a worldwide platform. While the many benefits of the online world are undeniable, the accompanying risks and challenges cannot be discounted. At FOSI, we do not seek to diminish the existence of these risks on the internet, but rather to focus on the constructive ways that they can be managed against the benefits and opportunities of being online. That's why we believe creating a culture of responsibility is the most effective framework to ensure that children are protected in the digital world. Hearings like this one today are an important part of the oversight and support role that government needs to play in order to create a safer internet for all. Additionally, we have been pleased to work with the First Lady on her Be Best initiative. As a membership organization, we push industry to go further and consider online safety throughout the development of new products and services. We support effective oversight of industry self-regulation, believing that this allows for maximum innovation and the development of creative solutions. We are grateful for the hard work of law enforcement, including those sitting here with me today, and we have a long history of working with NCMEC, which I really appreciate. It is imperative that they are fully resourced and given the tools and training to combat the rise in cybercrime. Parents must be engaged and knowledgeable about what their children are doing on the internet. We know that caregivers are worried about the amount of time their children are spending on devices, as well as the content that they are accessing. We seek to allay these concerns by empowering parents to confidently navigate the online world with their children. This involves exploring the internet alongside their kids and employing the many parental control tools provided by companies. First-rate technology training must be provided to all teachers, since they are often one of the first places that children and parents look for help and information on digital challenges. And most importantly, children must be taught to be good digital citizens, to know about the rights and responsibilities that come with being online, to understand the consequences of sharing personal information, and to empower them to make the right decisions when they see upsetting content or inappropriate behavior. The internet cannot be made 100% safe. We must foster resiliency in our children and give them the tools, both moral and technical, to deal with what they will inevitably encounter, both on and offline. The steps that we take to protect a 7-year-old will not be the same for a 17-year-old, although they are both minors. That's why we must move from protection to empowerment, from blocking to monitoring, from restrictions to responsibility. Let me conclude by urging you to not underestimate the benefits and opportunities that enrich the lives of so many American children. Their access to information, the freedom to express themselves, and the cultivation of skills that will equip them to compete and thrive in a connected world must be protected. It is only through working together that we can ensure that we acknowledge the risks, mitigate the real harms, and allow all children to reap the rewards of this digital world. Thank you for your time this morning, and I look forward to your questions.
Senator Blumenthal, you can make your opening statement. And
thanks, Senator Graham. Thank you, Senator Graham, for holding this hearing. It's supremely important that we face this question about protecting children online, and I want to particularly thank our witnesses, especially Mr. Clark. NCMEC has been at the forefront of this cause from the very start. I can remember well when Connecticut and other states established their child predator, sex offender registries, and then I argued in the United States Supreme Court to defend the constitutionality of our state laws. They were upheld, and your support was invaluable, so thank you. If anything, the task of protecting children has become all the more difficult since then. It was hard then, it's nearly impossible now, without the partnership of the big tech companies. Parents have a primary responsibility, but they need a more proactive and preventive role from the big tech companies. All too often, these companies have been inadequate and abysmally slow in responding. Last month, researchers found that YouTube's recommendation system was promoting videos that sexualized minors. Parents could post innocent videos of their kids, and YouTube's algorithms might shepherd the wrong people to them. And I'm disappointed, frankly, with YouTube's unwillingness to take basic steps that Senator Blackburn and I asked that they do to fix their platform. We have yet to receive an adequate response from them, and I'll be asking questions about it going forward. This May, a YouTube celebrity, Austin Jones, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for coercing and deceiving at least 6 underage girls into sending him sexually explicit videos. YouTube's initial response was to demonize his videos, saying that the channel didn't violate the terms of service. Only after significant negative press did they finally do the right thing. And that encapsulates and epitomizes the reactive nature of the tech companies addressing this problem or failing to address it. Let me just say in conclusion, as disappointed as I am in the failure of these companies to meet their own terms of service and to act more promptly and preventively, the failure of enforcement is in many ways even more disturbing, even shocking. What you just heard from Professor Campbell, I think, reflects my experience and others with the FTC's lapses and laxity in enforcement. If there's no deterrence and potential swift and sure punishment, these companies have a lot less incentive to enforce their own terms of service, not to mention morals and standards that the law provides. We need to set a national standard for tech companies as to how they protect children. We need to know that if a user is reported for abuse, social media sites will act immediately. We need to know that authorities and organizations like NCMEC will be provided all the evidence they need when children are threatened and the resources that are required. And we need to know that private, sensitive information about our kids will be kept safe and secure. I want to thank all of you for your very impressive work, particularly our enforcers who were here, and thank you for this opportunity to ask questions. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Stone, what percentage of the cases where you're trying to exploit a phone or other social media device where you have a warrant, the companies fail to help you?
I don't know that I could give you an exact percentage. I will tell you that
is it a big problem?
It is a big problem, and I think there's some at this point. There are just some phones that our investigators and our analysts recognize they cannot get into, and so whether they have a search warrant or not, they recognize that they're not going to be able to get past those encryption codes, so they're not even able to make the effort.
So from a prosecutor's point of view, if you had someone, a group of people, going to a schoolhouse and exposing themselves at a bus stop, it'd be front page news all over the world. And you'd put every resource possible to go find these people, right?
Yes, sir.
This happens literally every minute of every day, right?
It does.
So what can we do to have that same intensity? Track down the guy that's going to the school and doing inappropriate things to our children on the internet. What's missing?
I think that, first of all, what I think you are seeing throughout this country now is you are seeing prosecutions at both the state, federal level that are targeting these areas. Part of that, though, has to be the intelligence investigation aspect of it and trying to stay focused on that.
Mr. McKenna, you did set up a site to lure, to mimic a teenage girl, right?
Correct, yes.
What happened to the people who sent pictures of themselves?
Absolutely nothing. Their messages showed up in the direct message box of the Instagram account, and that's where they sit. We can report those accounts and then ask for Instagram through their reporting process to, do their own investigation and potentially take those accounts down. But in our experience, because you can set up a new Instagram account within seconds, all that does is create a blip in their behavior.
So how do we get to the bottom of that?
We would say that's a feature issue within Instagram, that the very nature in which we've identified 4 primary features that exist in Instagram create ripe opportunity for exploitation through direct messaging, even if you have a private account, through hashtags, which Instagram really is a mini search engine where there are no filters.
So the social media companies,
That's
within their power.
It's within their power. Their features
Gotcha.
create these opportunities.
Mr. Clark, tell me about the 18.4 million number. Put that in context. What are we talking about?
Those are cyber tip reports, Mr. Chairman, that come to us mostly from the electronic service providers or the large tech companies. About 98% of those come from the tech companies that are reported to us. The rest are from citizens who would report such content to us. Interestingly to report, when I took over as CEO at the center, we were at about 4 million or so cyber tip reports coming in annually. That was just 3.5 years ago. Last year, that number rose to 18.4 million. So it's due in part to the larger reporting requirements to the electronic service providers. But
what happens to these people, for lack of a better word, that are reported?
Well, we send those reports on. It's a global problem as well.
Does anybody ever get prosecuted?
They do. They do get prosecuted, Senator. That's the what we refer to as the good news. We work with the Internet Crimes Against Children task forces around the United States. We send those reports around the globe. About 93% of those reports have an international connection, which I think typifies the global nature of this problem. And so when those reports are sent to those particular entities, because we are not a law enforcement organization, we trust in their goodwill to try to find out, investigate, prosecute those individuals.
Is it creating a sense of deterrence?
I believe it is, in the sense that we have better reporting, and I think it's always good that you're getting more of that content identified. As I said in my initial testimony, it's a problem that we really can't arrest our way out of. The volume alone is just staggering.
Right. Ms. Campbell, what would be your simple message to this committee about the FTC and how they should up their game?
I would urge the FTC to enforce the law.
FEC, I'm sorry. Could you mash the button?
The
Yeah.
FCC really needs to enforce the provisions of COPPA.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are they doing?
I would say about 1/2. Good
news, there's a lot of potential to get better, yeah.
There is. I mean, there are so many violations. They're very easy to
Do
find.
you all recommend that we call in the tech companies and they sit where you're sitting?
Yes, I do. I think they bear a lot of the
We'll do that.
responsibility.
We'll do that. Senator Blumenthal, excuse me, Feinstein, Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree completely that we ought to be hearing from the tech companies, because I think on that scale of 1 to 10, 1/2 is probably generous, given the experience that you and others have outlined today. Would others agree that the tech companies can and should do more to protect children? Stone?
I do, Senator, and I would like to make a comment about what you previously said concerning YouTube. The dark web gets the majority of the attention when it comes to criminal issues. On the other hand, I believe that the more mainstream internet is actually just as dangerous. The videos that I described earlier, when they're the music videos that are professionally made that show the gang members with guns and drugs, show them belittling law enforcement, those recruiting tools trying to get our teenagers and our young people to join into their gangs are not being posted on the dark web. They're being posted on YouTube. We watch those in our office. So from that perspective, I think the mainstream more mainstream internet is something that we really need to be more concerned with right now.
And would you agree with me, and let me ask the other members of the committee as well, we can pass all the laws we want, and I'm a supporter of the Markey-Hawley revisions, and I will be a co-sponsor as soon as I'm able, if we have another Republican to join us. But the best laws in the world are dead letter if they're not enforced. And so would the members of this panel agree that the FTC should be doing a better job, as Professor Campbell has stated? Is there anyone who disagrees? And I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, maybe we should have the FTC testify as well. Sure. On an occasion separate from the tech companies. You indicated, Professor Campbell, that there have been 29 actions to enforce COPPA, essentially all settled inadequately by consent decree with minimal penalties, and that the FTC has so far failed to respond to the 14 requests for action. You outlined 2 of them. Would you be willing to provide the committee with the other 12?
Yes, of course.
In order to deter this kind of misconduct on the internet, let me ask Solicitor Stone and Mr. Clark, are the tech companies providing you with all the forensic data that and support that you need when you're investigating sexual exploitation?
Until we get to the issue of the encryptions, yes, sir. I think we are getting a good bit of that information. I prosecuted a case in May in which there was actually one 15-year-old that shot and killed another 15-year-old. The threat that the shooter made to the victim was over Snapchat. The problem with Snapchat is it's instantaneously, it goes away. So we were not able to get that material. The shooter also, when he was looking for his .40 caliber gun in order to gun down the other teenager, he posted that on Facebook, and we were able to pull all of the Facebook through a search warrant and get that material, which was crucial.
And I think you mentioned, as a matter of fact, that the Department of Defense sponsored MEMEX project, in effect, crawls the dark web, and is an example of the technical tools that maybe the federal government could provide for local and state law enforcement.
And thank you for saying that. Cyrus Vance is the Manhattan District Attorney. He used MEMEX, and he has actually testified to Congress concerning MEMEX, and that's correct. It crawls the dark web. It's an advanced search engine. Unfortunately, most prosecutors' offices do not have the resources to have that type of an advanced search engine. But I think in today's time, especially when we're dealing with human trafficking, I think we are seeing a very small percentage of the actual crime. And I think something like that advanced search engine is essential for us to determine exactly how big of a problem we're dealing with.
And that's an example of how the federal government might be of more assistance to you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Clark, how about forensic evidence from the big tech companies? Is it forthcoming?
Senator, the short answer to your question is there's great room for improvement. But I can tell you this, we have seen, thankfully, some improvement with that. For example, Microsoft's use of photo DNA and helping us to do a better job of tracking the images online through the hashing process. We also receive and have, by evidence at least of the cyber tip line, been receiving a lot more notifications through the electronic service providers and big tech that are reporting the images. Last year, I believe it was around 67,000 images that we also found. NCMEC discovered that we asked the big tech companies, ESPs, to take down, and they did. So we're doing better at that level of collaboration, but there is always room for improvement.
And they've been mostly reactive, not proactive, correct?
In essence, yes. Reactive is not really the role we'd probably want to see, although it is such a volume of imagery that is going out there around the globe, some of which is not just even coming from the United States, it's coming from other places around the world. It's very, very difficult to get all those tech companies, and right now we have about 1,500 of them that are working with us. but to get them all in line to help on that problem.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thanks to each of you for being here. This is an important topic. It reminds me of a time I was riding in the car with my then teenage sons a few years ago. A song came on the radio. I listened to the words of it. I concluded the words were bad, and I immediately told them, this is terrible, and I turned down the volume. My son John, at the time, without missing a beat, said, Dad, it's not bad if you don't think about it. And this is one of those things. We'd prefer not to have to think about it. This isn't bad if you don't think about it, but it's not bad only if you don't think about it. This is a crisis affecting our children, and it's not an abstract one. It's not a rare one. A 2018 Pew Research study concluded that 45% of America's teens today are online almost constantly, while another 44% are online at least several times a day. That's 89% of teens overall. And this is far from an abstract issue. Many of those people come into contact with things that harm them. Sometimes the results are severe. According to a Thorne study conducted in 2018, fully 55% of human trafficking survivors who were trafficked beginning in 2015 first encountered their trafficker online or via text message. Now, those are just sort of the extreme examples. Many others who were never trafficked end up being harmed by things that they're exposed to online. Collectively, the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store account for about 95% of app purchases in the United States. Now, to their credit, both Apple and Google use an age rating system and have some child-focused rules to prevent children from being exposed to things that they shouldn't be. And yet, some of the most popular apps sold through those stores, including things like YouTube and Snapchat and Instagram, can and often do, in fact, constantly do, provide sexually explicit content to children. And it's not just when a child is looking for that. It's happening when they input very innocent, childlike search terms that have nothing to do with sexual content. So, Mr. McKenna, I'd like to talk to you about this for a minute. What should app stores be doing differently with their rating measures to help prevent this kind of thing from happening, to help prevent providing this kind of sexually explicit content to children?
Thank you, Senator Lee. First and foremost, we simply want transparency and additional information for parents. In no other context where we know that young people are spending a lot of time do we allow for this much inaccuracy with the information that we give parents to know how to protect their kids. Like, I'm envisioning more of an analog example of a toy in a toy aisle that had some of the features of some of the things that we see on apps that are used by teens, and then just telling parents, well, mixed in with all the other things that your kids love, we just want you to avoid looking at that one place. We would simply never allow that to happen. And so when it comes to the app stores, we want there to be a unification. You referred to both Apple and Google, but they use very different processes, as we explained in my written testimony, to evaluate and also to score those apps. So there's this confusion, even if you look at one or the other. We also would argue that what you get is a very generic set of descriptions that really don't tell you what's actually going on inside of the app. So this transparency of what the true interactions are. If you were to look at the App Store description in Apple for Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat, three of the top social media platforms used by kids today, you would find the exact same description. In other words, there's nothing unique to tell us about any of the predatory risks or things specific to SnapMap, which is why we connect back to, say, the ESRB, where if you were to look at some of the top games that the ESRB has rated, there is volumes of information telling you exactly what goes on, what happens to certain body parts and blood and gore, and you walk away from this description as a parent with a clear view as to what I'm going to be putting in front of my children. Now, I still have, the option, but I've been informed. So we want that unification to make them the same, make it transparent, and provide some accountability so that when players in the App Store are not giving information to parents as they should, that there's some ramifications for that. Otherwise, behavior is just never going to change.
Well said. Demanding or expecting that a child behave like a good internet citizen falls on deaf ears, especially when someone is encouraging a child to use an app that at times acts like a strip club. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that we submit into the record the testimony of Don Hawkins, the Senior Vice President and Executive Director for the National Center on Child Exploitation.
Without objection. Senator Ernst.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the panelists today. This is a really hard topic for us to talk about openly, but I think it is vitally important. The internet has changed the way we do business so much, and it's so easy to access information. In some ways, that's really wonderful, but in other ways, I think about where we are today. I remember as a kid, and probably many of you too, at school, we talked about stranger danger and don't approach a van if a man has candy or puppies. Well, now that hypothetical van has gone away, and we have those that want to exploit our children using the internet as their van or their puppies or kitties. Just talking, we're talking about different apps, different devices, how we can protect our children. Are there ways that we can focus on the actual devices that our children are using? I mean, there's a way to block certain content and so forth. Should we be going further with that? Mr. McKenna, could you maybe, talk a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you, Senator. I believe there are very simple things that could be done almost instantly. Whenever we set up a device for our young people, whether it's an iPhone or an Android device, that device almost always knows the age of the primary user. Because when you set up an Apple ID, you put in a birthday. When you set up a Google account, you put in a birthday. And so we would simply submit as an idea that in setting up the device, what if there were simple defaults that were attached to an age, which removes all of the barriers. I speak to so many parents. I could tell you about a conversation I had on the airplane ride over here last night. In fact, I said, are you busy tomorrow at 10 o'clock? I'd love for you to come to this hearing. And she was relaying the difficulties as a doctor, a professor, even with her high level of education, to understand how to hunt for certain settings in a phone. Mm-hmm. So many of these things could be done by default, not only from a protection standpoint, but from a privacy standpoint. What if the posture of our digital devices was one of protection and privacy instead of exploitation, so that I have to search for protection? Instead, what I have now is I have to search for privacy. I have to search for parental controls in order to protect my children. And we would simply argue that the default posture should simply be the other way around, that if I want to choose to allow my children to have access to things, then that should be what I hunt for. Absolutely. Instead of the setting. I
agree. I think that's just smart. Since we are able to set up our devices, is to understand as a parent that there are ways to do that. But then also it does need to be easier. Correct. For heaven's sakes, I have a hard time figuring out my own device.
Excuse me.
Yes,
this
go
is
ahead.
very interesting to me. Could the FEC, could they do this by rule?
The FTC?
Yeah, whatever the agency is that does all those.
Sorry, no, the FTC doesn't have rulemaking authority except for COPPA. I think they could probably do something, but they haven't really used that authority much.
Okay, I'm just thinking of how you can make this a reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get
because
more time. Go
I think we can focus on. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we can focus on the apps, but I think that they could work in conjunction with our devices as well. And if we really want these tech companies to step up, I think that needs to be part of the equation as well. I know that my time is expiring, but no, I'll leave it there. I know we've got some other questions, but I do think that this is an area that we could delve a little deeper into. I think that there needs to be creative solutions coming from all angles, and not one of just apps and the different programs that exist out there on the internet, but also finding ways that we can use our devices as a screening mechanism to protect our children too. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Kennedy.
Mr. McKenna, if you were buying a phone today for your 14-year-old and you wanted to prevent her from being exploited sexually or exposed to things that she shouldn't see, what would you do?
My daughter does currently have a phone. She has an Android device that is used in certain very public places. So we've decided as a family that location matters, where kids use phones matters. We've also
I'm
put,
not asking about your daughter particularly.
but in general.
Yeah, what I'm getting at is what can a parent do
Sure.
right today to try to prevent their child from seeing this stuff?
Well, frankly, if they allow their children to use social media, there are very few parental controls that would prevent them from seeing these things. So the only way to prevent them from seeing the things that we experience on social media is to not allow them to use social media, which creates this sort of binary decision that parents are confronted with. Either we allow it or we don't. And if we allow it, we accept a certain level of risk.
But social media can be filtered, can it not?
If social media creators, in its current iteration, no. I cannot filter content on Instagram if I were to search for hashtags. Same is true on Snapchat. The nature of Snapchat is with
Let me
images.
put it another way. I'm interested in solutions. I think we all understand the problem.
Yeah.
Could Apple, for example, design a program that a parent could opt into, and the instructions to Apple would be design a program to filter all information that my daughter or son may see that could be sexually exploitive. Maybe filter all pictures or written references to human genitalia. Can that be done?
To be honest, Senator, I'm not sure.
Well, isn't that the short way home here? Sir, go ahead.
Senator, all of the major operating systems, all of the cell phone operators, all have got parental controls. What's very interesting is that the first White House summit that the First Lady held only last year, she called upon the tech companies to make...
But first, can it be done?
Yes. So just as
So could we write legislation or promulgate a rule that says, here's the thing that a reasonable parent would do to protect his or her child from seeing this stuff? And we do that in conjunction with somebody who has the obvious expertise. And you filter everything. I don't know how to do it. I can't write software. Maybe it is to prohibit any pictures of human genitalia or prohibit any references to sexual activity. I don't know. The kids aren't going to like it, but that's not who we're trying to please here. Why couldn't that be done? I think Senator Ernst is right. I mean, you can go fight with the social media companies and their lobbyists and their campaign contributions. And I mean, we've been talking for, 2 years about a privacy bill? Hadn't seen one. Okay? Don't know if we'll ever see one. That's not a criticism of anybody. It's just the way this place is. We need a microwave, not a crock pot here. And I just don't see why Apple can't just write a program. Are they going to miss some things? Sure. But if they're in good faith, write me a program, put it into my phone that's going to filter all this stuff and do it in good faith and look over their shoulders. Can we do that?
So just give you an example, Verizon has something called Smart Family that will do exactly what you're asking to do, and they've created it as AT&T has their own and T-Mobile has their own without having created a law. I don't know how, I'm not a lawyer.
Can it be done?
It is being done, Senator.
Okay, can we require that?
That
be put in every operating
I will
device?
defer to my...
If we did require that to be put in every operating device? Would that solve the problem substantially?
I don't know about how you craft the law, and there are already parental controls in the devices. Our biggest challenge is to educate parents that these things are there.
We can't legislate on that. Let me ask one other quick question of the professor. Professor, you think there's some people at the FTC who are doing a lousy job on this, don't you?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know who they are?
It's the Bureau of Consumer Protection.
Okay. Would you support legislation to make it easier to fire them?
I don't know that that's the solution, Senator.
You don't think somebody ought to be fired when they're doing a lousy job?
Well, perhaps, but, I think we need to look at the reasons why they're not doing the job
How about
they should.
because they're lazy, or they're not interested, or they're just not very good employees?
Perhaps, sir, I'm not really.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of you for being here. And Senator Kennedy, we've been on this issue of privacy and data security for 7 years. Yeah. I led that working group in the House. I do have a privacy bill you can sign on. It's called the Browser Act.
I've got a bunch of bills.
Be happy to have your support and to push this to finish, because we need to. I thank the chairman for this hearing, and I thank Senator Blumenthal for working with me on this issue. And to each of you, I thank you for your attention on this. I have to tell you, as I watched and read what was happening with Jeffrey Epstein this weekend, and that arrest, and how the authorities found hundreds of nude photos of these underage girls in his home. And I think his case serves as a warning that predators really do lurk. And Mr. Clark, this is partly to your point and Mr. McKenna's point. They lurk in every corner of society, whether it's the rich and the powerful or the poor and depraved. And those protections that have existed in the physical world many times are not being transferred to the virtual space. And you each have spoken to that. And I think, as you've said, these predators no longer lurk in AOL chat rooms. They are right there on all of these apps that our precious children are using, whether it is Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or GroupMe or any of those. Unfortunately, we do not have that regulation, and many of us have focused on this issue of safety of children online for years. I'm glad the Justice Department and General Barr are working on this. They've got the Safe Neighborhoods program. I do hope these groups are working with you and going after these predators. I think that Deputy AG Stacey Harris, who is doing work with the National Strategy for Child Exploitation, is really focused on these tech platforms, and having a collaborative effort is going to be important. I had reviewed that case from a couple of years ago, the Soledad case from California. When ICE agents apprehended him, he was caught using Snapchat to try to coerce a 13-year-old boy to send him sexually explicit video. And then the parents called the police. And then when ICE agents got involved, they found 5 more victims, ages 12 to 15. The children lived in Tennessee, Texas, Georgia, Illinois, and California. And each victim was coerced using a social media application. That is how this sick, vile human being was going after these children. And I will tell you, as a mom, as a grandmom, it is really so disheartening to me to see children used as a center for profit on these social media platforms. And a few years ago, the EFF filed a complaint with the FTC regarding an investigation into Google's surveillance of school children on Chromebooks. And to the professor's point about the lack of follow-up and due diligence, that is being done by the FTC. This is one of those areas where they go in, they scoop the data, they track, they follow, and they've got that virtual you, if you will, of that child, because they have all of that identifying information on that child, their virtual presence. I do have a couple of questions. I've talked through much of my time. Mr. McKenna, I will just say this. You mentioned Mr. Zuckerberg. He has fought us on privacy for years. Finally, he is changing his tune. You've talked about some of these dangers. What can the apps like Instagram and Snapchat do, specifics, to embed into these applications? They can manipulate these algorithms if they so choose. They are choosing not to do it. So if you were building that algorithm, what would you embed?
We would simply allow, to Mr. Balkam's point, we want children to learn how to use technology and to use these apps. We just would argue that parents need a choice as to what features their children do and don't have access to inside of these apps. So if I were creating a picture app, I would allow children to truly have a private account with a curated set of contacts that would not allow people who are not a part of that curated list to be in contact with me.
Much like the Apple Watch is doing now.
That's correct. And so I would eliminate the ability for strangers to contact.
Okay, let me move on to, and I'm going to ask you to submit this to me. You mentioned the video game rating, and I was in the House when we handled that process. I think Mortal Kombat was the big game.
It was.
And what I would like for you to do is to submit in writing for the record how you would approach this ratings system, because I agree with you. The ratings are totally wrong on these apps, and therefore the parents do not have the information to make an informed decision, nor do they realize that when you're in Snap and you get into that Discover section or that news feed, then it is, and I had said this yesterday when I was looking through some of these things, I said, this is almost what we went through with the video games and Mortal Kombat. One thing leads you to another, and it is deeper and further down the chain of what is acceptable or even expected by parents. So I thank each of you for your diligence in your work in protecting children, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for being here and for your testimony on this very important issue. I think we can agree that exploiting children online is one of the worst dangers and one of the worst social threats that we face. But let's talk about whether or not being callous towards children's safety is actually a part of the business model of some of these companies. And my concern is that it is. And I think you don't have to look any further than the reports about YouTube, the New York Times reporting last month about the algorithm collecting and funneling videos of minor children to pedophiles. And of course, as we have discussed this morning, allowing those pedophiles to contact the children. This report was sickening, but I think what was even more sickening was YouTube's refusal to do anything about it. YouTube admitted that they could do something about it. They could stop auto-referring these videos of minors to pedophiles, but they chose not to do so. Why not? Because their model is that 70% of their business, 70% of their traffic, it comes from these auto-recommended videos. In other words, there's ad revenue that would be lost if they actually took some enforcement steps here, took some steps to stop this exploitation of children. So my first question is, does anybody here think that one of the world's largest, most powerful companies should be privileging their ad revenue over children's safety? Well, that's why I introduced a bill that would require YouTube to do what it can do, what it absolutely has the power to do, which is to stop recommending videos that feature children unless those videos fall within very carefully tailored safety and exceptions. And it would apply not only to YouTube, but it would apply to any video hosting company. It's common sense legislation. I hope this committee will hold a hearing on it. I hope we'll mark it up. I hope we'll refer it to the full Senate and act to actually protect our children online. Let me just ask you, Mr. McKenna, do you agree that for some of these companies, aspects of their business model actually conflict with protecting the safety of children?
Thank you for the question, Senator Hawley. I absolutely agree that the business model based on reach and engagement is one that absolutely conflicts with protection.
What else can we do about that? Tell us more about how the design of some of these companies' model and their platforms pulls against the goal of safety for children online.
Well, the simple premise of Snapchat, which is one based on images that disappear, right? They have a model that wants young people to use an app that neurologically they're not ready to use. And so the entire platform is built on something that we would argue that teens just are not ready to engage in. So Snapchat could be doing so much more in terms of the types of friend referrals that happen, in terms of what happens in Discover News. They know that in Discover, which is where third parties will put articles, is where revenue occurs. That's where engagement happens. Again, they're based on an engagement model. They want more people looking at that content, and that just feeds that cycle of revenue.
Is it your sense that Snapchat and other similar platforms are engaging in practices that, at least as it relates to their child users, are exploitative?
Absolutely. Knowing in no other places where we have significant numbers of children spending time do we allow so few controls to govern those environments, right? I mean, 16 million teens are using Snapchat. Even if the app were to say that we are for adults only, I believe they have a duty of care responsibility for a population of teens that they know are using their app to protect them.
Professor Campbell, you were nodding your head. Do you agree with that, and do you want to add something on this point? And then I want to ask you about COPPA.
Yes, I would add, just to give you an example of how I think a company could do a better job of structuring its products. YouTube actually has a product intended for children called YouTube Kids, and it's got some good policies. The problem, again, is that they're not really enforcing those policies. There's a lot of content on even on YouTube Kids that is inappropriate, and we've complained to the FTC about this. So one of the reasons is that they designed the product so that all programming on YouTube Kids first has to be on YouTube. So all of these kids' channels are on YouTube, and so kids are watching it on YouTube instead of YouTube Kids, and then they're getting exposed to all the advertising, and of course, Google's benefiting from those ad revenues. So if they had designed YouTube Kids differently so that it was actually protected space for children, that would have been a good thing, but that's not what they chose to do.
Let me thank you for that. That's really helpful. Let me just ask you briefly here about COPPA. You mentioned the need for the FTC to get serious about enforcement for updates to COPPA. I'm proud to be co-sponsoring with Senator Markey, major update to COPPA, the first in 20 years, that would provide sweeping new privacy protections for children. It would also apply to any company that has reason to know that a child is a user, even if they don't have actual knowledge, constructive knowledge, which we think is hugely significant for actually holding these companies accountable. Let me just ask you, though, you mentioned earlier that the FTC may be able to use some rulemaking authority under COPPA, either the existing COPPA or our proposed update, to require new default privacy settings for devices or on platforms. Should we be thinking about in the COPPA update including language to this effect? I mean, what would you counsel us to do to make this COPPA update as tough and as comprehensive as possible?
Well, one problem is what we call dark patterns, and that's when a company will create incentives for users to do something that is not necessarily in the user's interest but does benefit the company. And so what Mr. McKenna was talking about with making it difficult to find privacy settings, not setting defaults to protect privacy, those are part of the dark pattern problem. They can make it very easy for them to do what you want to do and make it very difficult, even if you make a lot of effort, to change those privacy settings or protect yourself.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your work on this important topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you all for being here. Mr. Balkam, could you talk a little bit about the initiative with the First Lady? What does a successful end state look like?
She chose cyberbullying, online safety as her main task to work on as First Lady. She's also included opioid abuse and general well-being of children. We've been very impressed with her approach.
What does that look like in terms of the impact that it would have on the technology providers? I mean,
I think it's raised the subject and the topic to the front, and it said, look, at the highest levels, there is concern and there is a challenge to you technology companies to step up and to deal with this issue.
Mr. McKenna, when you were exchanging questions and answers with Senator Ernst, you brought up the concept of trying to figure out a way to understand who's likely to use a phone. I'm a technology person. I'm trying to get my head around the numbers because there are some 300 million cell phones in use in the United States. That number's only going to grow. Many of those are in the hands of adults who may leave them. They may not be password protected. The kid picks up mom and dad's phone and plays games on it. So I'm trying to figure out practically how we could do that. There's also, I think in the last census, some estimate at 89% of all households have some personal computer. We haven't even talked about one of the other portals into all this horrible activity that we've also got to sweep into this. There are so many ways, and the Internet of Things, who knows what's next in terms of being able to drive content to you and possibly have a child respond to it. Has there been any sort of collaboration between groups like yourselves and the tech industry to sit down and figure out the short and long-term strategy for doing this? Because I know I follow a lot on texting while driving. As a matter of fact, I got criticized back when I was in the North Carolina State House for apparently denying somebody their constitutional right to endanger my drive while they're interacting with a phone going down the road, which seems silly to me. But now we know 1 in 4 accidents are likely attributed to texting while driving. So I understand what you all are here for, but I think if we really take a look at how we're going to make the new Internet of Things a safer environment for youth and young adults and adults, we've got to really, instead of looking at any one area as the solution to the problem, we have to look at this holistically, or we're only going to scratch the surface on what I consider to be the public health and public safety crisis. So if we go back, though, to the idea of the phone, I immediately think about when you go and set up an Apple ID or you go and set up a Google ID, you could lie and say you're 18
Sure.
or 16 or 14 or 25. So who's responsible for determining the honesty of the user of that platform? I mean, let's say you're a 14-year-old who lied because your parents gave you access to the credit card or whatever you needed to open up an Apple ID account. You lied and said you're 20. Who's responsible in that case?
The parents in that case, no question.
I'm glad you answered the question that way. I was hoping you would, because I think at some point we also have to recognize we can not only weave into this discussion the responsibility of the tech providers, which are constantly changing.
Correct.
And if all of a sudden we put the big tech on notice and they do the right thing, then little tech's going to come in and provide a different solution. Mm-hmm. So what we also have to weave into the public consciousness is you're giving your child a potentially lethal device. And at some point in time, we have to have a discussion about the parents' responsibility for making that device safe or taking it away from them. Here's a concept. At 9 o'clock, they don't get the phone until they get ready to go to school.
Right.
I mean, we've got to start having, as a matter of public policy discussions, we have to have the discussion with the parents about understanding their routers, understanding you can prohibit access to all of these sites if you choose to, if your kid's connected to the hotspot at home. And then coming up with a balanced solution that absolutely mandates that technology providers get a handle on the content and the potential lethality of that content. But we have to get the parents and those who provide the technology to these young people into the equation.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And in doing so, make it as minimally complex as possible.
Right, and
because
I think
that's
Senator
the
Ernst
idea.
is absolutely right.
Correct.
Unless you, because then you can actually place more responsibility on the people who are ultimately they have to take care of their children.
Correct.
If you opt out of this, if you allow them to go into a gaming environment that potentially leads to a dangerous outcome, if you opt out of these things that we would suggest would require an explicit act, then the parents ultimately have to be held accountable for that.
Senator, if I may, it's why we created the Good Digital Parenting Initiative. And we distilled all of our experience and expertise to something called the 7 steps to good digital parenting, which you can put on the back of your fridge door if you want to. And key to this is talking with your kids, sitting down and setting parental controls, using a family safety contract with your children. And critically, and what's missing in all of this also, is parents being good digital role models themselves, putting that phone down at dinner, not texting while driving, giving your kids eye-to-eye contact when they come for it. So parents are absolutely critical part of this. They are the least well served, however, in terms of information and support.
But I do, just on a final note, I don't know if any of you all, or final question, and if you have the statistics, there was a news report about a month ago for some of, it may have been Google or YouTube, but they have operations set up where they have people, it's a horrible job, I can't imagine ever doing it, where they're reviewing all this content. Do we have any idea about how much of the malign content is being interdicted by the current processes versus what's getting through? I think that's another thing that we need to do to see to what extent do we scale what they're already doing to cast a wider net. Those are the sorts of things we have to talk about if we're going to come up with good, sustainable policy that lets us benefit from all the great things the internet has given us. But also address the public safety risks that you're all here today, and I appreciate it. But that sort of information, if you have any, that can give me an idea of, I know we're doing poorly, but what efforts out there, if we simply scaled them, could reduce a lot of the problems so that we can narrowly focus legislative outcomes and regulatory outcomes. Would appreciate your feedback.
Senator, I may not be able to give you exact numbers on what we're missing, but I will tell you this. Our Attorney General's office in South Carolina prosecutes about 250 of these offenders every year. But what is more disturbing through the ICAC, or the Internet Crimes Against Children, what is more disturbing, I think, to me, looking at those gross numbers, is while those indictments are being brought, their investigators are working through about 85 new cases every year. And in those 85 new cases, they are seeing over 1 million, it's right at 1,086,000 files of child pornography that they are having to go through. So the numbers that we're talking about are massive.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of brief questions. We haven't really talked about data mining and the threat to children's security from the extraordinary, exponentially exploding means of gathering information about children. COPPA was never designed for toys connected to the internet, toys with cameras, toys that often have their own security vulnerabilities. I'm part of a working group that is examining proposals to assure protections for privacy. And one of our models is the California Consumer Privacy Act that requires businesses to get opt-in consent to sell information of children under the age of 16. I believe that the rest of the country ought to follow California's example and impose the strictest protections possible. Does everyone on this panel agree that the standard for consent and strict privacy protections under federal rules should be expanded to cover children and minors under 16?
Yes, sir.
Mr. McKenna? Yes. Mr. Clark? I'm glad that everyone agrees. Professor Campbell, you suggest that all child-directed content should be placed on a separate platform where targeted advertising, commercial data collection, links to other sites or content, comments, and autoplay are prohibited. And I agree that that kind of separate platform would help protect children. Would legislation be required for it if it were imposed rather than done voluntarily?
I think it's possible that that's something that the Federal Trade Commission could negotiate with YouTube as part of, if they are investigating them and trying to settle the case as part of the settlement. But otherwise, I think they couldn't require that under existing law.
Would that approach have applications beyond YouTube? In other words, to...
Well, that's the problem with consent decrees. They're only binding on the parties to the consent decrees.
So it would probably require legislation
Yes.
that require the FTC to impose that kind of separate platform on a variety of other sites.
Yes.
And let me ask, finally, if each of you were to design, or let me ask you, Professor Campbell, initially, heightened safeguards for children and minors to protect against this kind of data mining, what additional steps would you take?
Well, one of the important things is to limit the data collection to only the data that's absolutely necessary, and the other is to not allow companies to retain the data beyond the time that's reasonably necessary to use it. And we're seeing this happening a lot, for example, with the Amazon Echo Dot speaker for kids. It's specific for kids, but they're saving the voice recordings of children and the translations of those voice recordings in many cases indefinitely, and there's no way to even delete all of them even when the parent tries, so except to take their child out of the service. And a lot of times you want your child to be able to use these services. So I think that we really need to focus on data minimization and also data security, because the data that's available to companies can easily be available through data brokers and other sources to predators and lots of other people.
And data minimization is another requirement of the California law and the
and of the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act.
Exactly. Any other suggestions from other members of the panel on this topic? My thanks again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses for being here and testifying on this very important topic. Mr. McKenna, an article last month in the New York Times detailed how YouTube's recommendation algorithm can lead users from adult pornography to videos of girls as young as 5 or 6 years old wearing bathing suits. Do you know if YouTube has changed their algorithms regarding child exploitation? And if not, what can and should YouTube do to stop this?
Senator Cruz, thank you on that very important topic. I am not aware that YouTube has changed their algorithm. I'm guessing if they would have done that, that would have been newsworthy, and parents everywhere would have been celebrating that, but I have not been aware of that news. I believe that YouTube, in their vast knowledge, has the ability to, in the same way that they can recommend videos, they can choose not to recommend videos, and that would simply be a change that they would have to choose to make.
Wired reported that sexual predators use the comments section of YouTube videos to help other predators find videos. For example, they would announce times in videos that would be of particular interest to sexual predators. YouTube, thankfully, disabled commenting on many of the videos of children under 13. Has this prevented sexual predators from using YouTube to spread this information, or is it simply moving the problem elsewhere?
I believe it's a step in the right direction. I'm happy that they've made this change. I believe that that should mitigate some of the activity, but based on our experience, these individuals are extremely creative. And the comments section, irrespective of platform, whether it's YouTube or Instagram and other platforms that allow comments, are all breeding grounds for this sort of networking of pedophiles. So if it's not going to be on YouTube, it'll simply move to another platform, and we've been witness to that.
As you know, a little over a year ago, we passed and the President signed into law the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, which amended Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to strip immunity from online platforms that knowingly assist, facilitate, or support sex trafficking. How successful has SESTA been in combating sex trafficking, and what else does Congress need to do? And that's open to anyone who.
Senator, good question. I think SESTA largely has helped take down, I think of Backpage.com, for example, certain ads that were attractive to the networks. As Mr. McKenna said, it shared a likeness for trying to recruit and find and entice young women, kids, into sex for sale. But I would also say that it seems like when one disappears, another one appears. That's a global issue, as we've been saying, across the country, United States, plus the world now. We're seeing still an increase on those number of chat sites, video sites, opportunities for exploitation to continue in a digital world.
Last year, a Texas woman sued Facebook for providing human traffickers with a way to, quote, stalk, exploit, recruit, groom, and extort children into the sex trade. In y'all's judgment, are Facebook and the other social media sites doing enough to combat exploitation of their platforms by sex traffickers?
Senator, once again, I'd say there's room for improvement here. I think what we've seen with the cooperation of the tech companies on the plus side, being participative in things that we're doing like cyber tip roundtables, bringing the tech companies together so that we can have a collaborative approach. If there's ever been a cause for what I'd call a true public-private partnership, this is it. But of all the tech companies that handle reporting to NCMEC, about 1,500 of them, would be, I think, suffice to say that many of them still can do more.
Senator Cruz, thank you. What I was trying to formulate in my head to say was that not enough is being done, and in our experience, it doesn't feel as though until there's a huge news report or there's some pressure, there's always this reactive response to these sort of issues from these large companies. They are brilliant organizations. I am confident that they have in their know-how the ability to, within weeks, take care of many of the problems that we have spoken about here at this hearing. But it's not until they're pushed or there's pressure or there's reputational damage or something that they seem to move. And even then, in the case of YouTube, they're still unwilling to do some very simple things that we think would protect children. And so that's my greatest concern, is that there's this continual resistance and reactive approach to the problems that to us feel so obvious.
Well, and I would certainly be interested, I know the committee would, in any of the witnesses' recommendations for additional steps that need to be taken, because this has to be continually addressed and vigorously addressed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Campbell, you want to say something?
I just wanted to give an example, again, using YouTube. I have to wonder, why are so many under 13-year-olds on YouTube when the terms of service prohibit them from using YouTube? And so I think, again, if children were using a different site, or separate site, that you wouldn't have as much problem with predators. And I think that it is true that it's a global problem, because you'll see the same kids, the same little kids, like, you know, in a outdoor pool in their bathing suit, promoting toys. They're being paid by products to promote these toys, and they're on all of the different platforms as well. And so it is a problem that I think needs to be looked at across platforms.
Senator Blumenthal.
I want to thank Senator Cruz for mentioning SESTA and also Section 230, which in some ways is the elephant in the room, right? the immunity, which is so broad and uniquely encompassing by many of the tech companies, is part of the reason that they are failing to do more. Because you mentioned, Mr. McKenna, the potential duty of care, standard of care, which is enforceable only if there is some accountability. And right now, the biggest obstacle to accountability is Section 230. So I appreciate Senator Cruz mentioning SESTA. Senator Portman and I were the co-sponsors of SESTA. It was strongly supported by NCMEC. We thank you again for your help on it. I think it's an example of the bipartisan action that I hope will emerge from this very excellent hearing, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just along those lines to sum up, things would change tomorrow if you could get sued. So the problem with getting sued about providing content, if you're responsible for everything that flows through your business organization in terms of content, you probably drive at least new people out of business and maybe put the old people in jeopardy of folding. But what I'd like to do is make sure that you're earning this liability protection. That under Section 230, you're a neutral platform for you to have that liability protection when it comes to exploiting children, that you're earning it, that we come up with best business practices. And if you meet those best business practices, you have a safe haven from liability. If you don't, you're going to get sued. So it seems to me that we need to come up with a set of best business practices to protect children, whether it's the device itself or whatever. You know, if you have a default, if we think that's the best thing for the country, then if you have set up a system where if you're a minor, the default thing kicks in, then you're good to go. So what I want to do is look at what are the best business practices when it comes to protecting children from exploitation on the internet. And if you meet those best business practices, you're okay. If you don't, you're going to get sued. Seems to me that will do more good than anything else. The solutions come from the people in the private sector, as long as they're legitimate, and people like you will tell us if these are legitimate. So rather than the government telling you what to do, you need to find out what does work, and we'll certify at the government level whether or not it's genuine. And if you pass that sort of government audit, then you're good to go. If you don't, then you're exposed to lawsuits from moms and dads and everybody else. So that's where I'd like to take this discussion, because 230 is the elephant in the room. And what I'd like to do is leverage that elephant in the room, that you can have these liability protections because we want to save the industry and preserve it for competition, but you have to earn it. And what have I learned from this hearing? You've got a lot of liability protections, but you're not doing a whole lot to earn it. Thank you very much for your testimony.